Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling instances in Ozark Mountain history. Please let me know where you're watching from and what time you're listening to this narration in the comments section before we start. Which locations and what times of day or night these recorded stories reach are of interest to us. It was 1866. The untamed landscape of the Ozark Mountains was mostly unaffected by the destruction that had engulfed other regions of the country following the conclusion of the American Civil War. However, another type of gloom was developing in the remote settlement of Hollow Creek, which is tucked away between the precipitous ridges of what is now Newton County, Arkansas. The Blackwood family, who resided in a cabin some 3 miles east of the village close to what the locals named Whispering Pine Ridge, had a kid, according to local documents from the Hollow Creek Church Registry. In 1864, James and Martha Blackwood had relocated to the region in order to escape the war. James, a former Tennessee schoolteacher, had a noticeable limp from an accident as a child that prevented him from enlisting in the military. Census records show that Martha was originally from Virginia and had moved west as a young woman with her family. As was common in the remote homesteads dotted over the hillsides, the pair was known to stay to themselves. Reverend Elijah Porter, who wrote in his own notebook that he had been called to the Blackwood cabin on a very cold February morning, recorded the birth of their son, Samuel. Some would subsequently point to this seemingly routine observation as the first clue that something was wrong. "The child appears healthy," he wrote, "though the mother seems unnaturally distant. I offered prayer but felt an unusual heaviness in that house." The sole doctor within 20 miles, Dr. William Hargrove, was not there when the baby was born. According to his notes, he checked the child for the first time 3 weeks later and reported that the infant was healthy and of normal growth. In a letter dated June 1866, Dr. Hargrove revealed to his colleague, Dr. Thomas Reed of Springfield, the unnerving feeling he had when around the youngster, something he had neglected to include in his official ledger. "There is something in the infant's gaze that disturbs me greatly," the writer stated. The doctor was accompanied on this visit by his wife, Mrs. Sarah Hargrove, who said, "I find myself unable to maintain eye contact for more than a moment. She first thought the boy was unusually lovely, with eyes that seemed to possess wisdom beyond his weeks." According to her secret diary, which was uncovered in 1954 while the old Hargrove house was being renovated. But during the examination, she wrote, "The room grew unnaturally cold despite the fire, and I found myself wanting to leave with an urgency I could not explain." Mrs. Hargrove, who was a pragmatic woman who was skeptical of superstition, never again went to the Blackwood house with her husband. Life at the Blackwood cabin went smoothly for the first 6 months. Although neighbors observed that Martha was never seen in town following the birth, James continued to occasionally travel into Hollow Creek for supplies. In 1868, Abigail Turner, who co-owned the general store with her husband, reported to a traveling journalist that James had become more reclusive and that his once tidy appearance was slowly degrading. "He would purchase his goods quickly, rarely engaging in conversation," she stated. James Blackwood's purchases gradually changed over time, according to business ledgers kept in the Hollow Creek Historical Society collection. His hands often trembled when counting coins. He started by purchasing standard home items like coffee, sugar, wheat, and lamp oil. But by June, he was routinely buying odd amounts of salt, which was said to fight off bad forces in mountain legend. By July, he had added a significant number of candles to his usual purchases, enough to give the impression that the cabin was always lit. In August of 1866, the first really alarming stories started to surface. Trapper Silas Jenkins, who occasionally went close to the Blackwood property, claimed to have heard strange noises emanating from the cabin's direction. Instead of a child's cry, he described them as a continuous, human inflectionless sound that sounded somewhere between a hum and a whisper. Normally a level-headed man, Jenkins was sufficiently shaken to bring it up to Reverend Porter, who noted it in his journal but did nothing about it. While hunting in the area a week later, Ezekiel Thompson, another local man, reported having a similar encounter. In a letter to his brother in Little Rock, he recounted how, just after nightfall, he passed within a quarter mile of the Blackwood cabin. "I heard what I took to be singing," he stated. though in no language I could recognize. Thinking perhaps it was a prayer meeting or some such gathering, I approached closer, only to find the sound unchanged in volume regardless of my distance from the cabin. It seemed to fill the air all around, yet when I stopped to listen carefully, I could not say with certainty that I heard it with my ears rather than inside my own mind. Thompson, unlike Jenkins, got close enough to observe the interior of the cabin. He claimed to have seen a light traveling from window to window, as though someone were carrying a lantern from one room to another, but the movement was too steady and well-timed to appear organic. Refusing to get any closer, he told his brother that something in my very bones urged me to retreat. By September, there was a silent worry over Martha Blackwood's disappearance from the public eye. In response to the Reverend's question during a fortuitous meeting in town, James said simply that his wife was committed to raising their son, which, at first glance, sounded like a plausible enough reply. But according to Dr. Hargrove's records, on September 24th, he was called to the Blackwood cabin to treat Martha for what James called a persistent melancholy. The doctor recommended light exercise, fresh air, and a tonic standard remedies for what was then commonly known as nervous exhaustion. Considering the distances involved, Dr. Hargrove's observations during this visit were reportedly so alarming that he noted that he would return within the week. The child, now 7 months old, displays none of the usual behaviors of infancy. He neither cries nor laughs, but watches with an intensity that I find deeply unsettling. He wrote in his personal notebook, which was found after his death in 1879. Mrs. B. seems thin, doesn't talk much, and keeps looking at the cradle as though something invisible is pulling her there. According to a later letter to Dr. Reed, Hargrove made an effort to talk to Martha about her son's progress during this visit. She gave evasive and frequently contradicting answers. She asserted that Samuel had started talking at one point, which would have been incredibly early for a 7-month-old baby. Martha reportedly became upset and declined to provide more details when asked what the child had said. She denied making the assertion at all later in the same conversation. Additionally, Hargrove noticed odd marks on Martha's wrists, which she concealed with her sleeves but showed when she reached for her tea. James swiftly interrupted to say that Martha had cut herself while collecting blackberries. Despite Martha's evident suffering and James's increasing anger, the doctor did not pursue the subject, noting that the marks seemed too consistent and intentional to have been made by brambles. Hargrove requested to see the child before leaving. A brief, yet unsettling encounter is described in his notes. Upon approaching the cradle, I experienced a sensation of profound cold, despite the fire burning not 3 feet away. The infant lay perfectly still, eyes open and fixed upon me with an intensity I have never before observed in a child of any age. When I reached to lift him for examination, Mrs. B. made a sound of such distress that I was momentarily startled. In that instant, I would swear the child smiled, not the reflexive gesture of infancy, but an expression of knowing amusement that chilled me more deeply than the inexplicable cold. The scheduled follow-up visit with the doctor never happened. When he finally managed to return to the Blackwood cabin in mid-October, the situation had drastically worsened due to an unexpected influenza outbreak in Hollow Creek that required his care. Bedridden, Martha only spoke in whispers and refused to eat. James looked gaunt, his clothes filthy, his demeanor tense. The infant's behavior most disturbed the doctor, who observed that the child sits upright unassisted, though this is early for such development, and maintains a fixed gaze upon whoever enters the room. Hargrove made a number of alarming notes on this visit. The cabin, which had previously been described as being well maintained, was now in a condition of chaos. Dust collected in corners, food sat rotten on the table, and the only area that seemed to be frequently treated was the area just surrounding the child's cradle. In this section, Hargrove observed items placed at what seemed to be carefully measured distances from each other, forming a pattern I initially assumed to be random, but later realized approximated a circle around the cradle. The arrangement was oddly precise. Martha's health has gotten much worse. Her complexion was so pale that it was translucent, and she was quite thin. Although there was food and water in the cabin, Hargrove observed symptoms that were consistent with severe starvation and dehydration. The most worrisome were what he called episodes of fixed attention, in which Martha would become completely inattentive to outside stimuli, including physical contact, and concentrate her gaze on a particular spot in the room, typically facing the child. When asked about his wife's decline, James gave evasive and frequently inconsistent answers. He once said that she had a prolonged fever, while another claimed she had fallen. James grew defensive, and then suddenly blank when Hargrove pointed out that her symptoms didn't fit either theory. In the middle of the debate, his gaze strayed to the child's cradle. Physically, the boy had developed normally, but his behavior was still radically out of the ordinary. He needed no assistance to sit completely erect in his crib, even though he was only 8 months old. When he did move, it was said to be intentional and smooth, devoid of the clumsy gestures typical of infants. Hargrove found the child's constant attention to be the most upsetting. Throughout my examination of Mrs. B, the child's eyes followed every movement of my hands with unnatural precision. When I met his gaze directly, I experienced a sensation I can only describe as pressure, as if something were attempting to intrude upon my thoughts. James declined to take Martha to Springfield for therapy, citing financial constraints and the challenge of transportation, despite Dr. Hargrove's recommendation. Instead, the doctor gave James more tonic and told him to notify him if her situation got worse. Such a message never appeared. However, stories spread by hunters and trappers, passing close to the increasingly remote Blackwood property, were what made it to Hollow Creek. They related stories of James Blackwood making an unexpected appearance on far-off paths miles from his home, only to disappear once more into the forests, and of lights moving in the woods surrounding the cottage at odd hours. Benjamin Foster, a mail carrier whose route led him along the main trail about a mile from the Blackwood property, provided one such report. Foster wrote that just after dawn in early November, he saw James Blackwood standing still in the center of the path. Blackwood's appearance was concerning, according to Foster's statement to the county sheriff. His clothing torn and soiled, his face gaunt, his eyes vacant, as if in deep shock. When he was addressed, he did not immediately respond, but then spoke with unusual speed, asking Foster if he heard the whispering. Before Foster could respond, Blackwood reportedly smiled in a way that the mail carrier found extremely unsettling, saying, "He's learning our ways. Soon he won't need us at all." Then, according to Foster, Blackwood turned and walked into the dense forest perpendicular to the trail, vanishing from view in a matter of seconds. Worried by the experience, Foster brought it up to Reverend Porter when they arrived at Hollow Creek later that day. A welfare check was deemed necessary by the Reverend, who was already disturbed by earlier complaints and the Blackwoods' prolonged absence from church services. After discussing his worries with Dr. Hargrove, they decided to go see the cabin on the 12th of November, 1866. Reverend Porter made the decision to visit the Blackwoods with Dr. Hargrove, 2 local men, Silas Jenkins and Abigail's husband, Michael Turner. Several sources have reported what they discovered, but with minor differences in specifics. Even though it was cold in the fall, the cabin door remained open. They found Martha Blackwood inside, in bed, very thin, but still alive. James was looking at the wall, while seated at the table. The Reverend recounted that neither acknowledged our presence until directly addressed, and then with only the slightest recognition. The child was in a cradle near the fireplace, which contained only cold ashes despite the chill in the air. Turner's later account, provided to a Springfield newspaper in 1868, added a detail not included in the official reports. The walls of the cabin were covered with markings, not writing exactly, but symbols drawn in what looked to be ash from the fireplace. Circles, mainly, one inside another, with strange marks between the rings. They covered every wall, even the ceiling in places, though most were concentrated around the child's cradle. During their visit, Martha only spoke once, to say, "He watches." Dr. Hargrove's examination showed that she was very malnourished and suffering from what he called mental aberration. In a statement taken the next day and recorded by the county clerk, Jenkins called the cabin scene wrong in ways I cannot properly explain. He said that although basic housekeeping had been clearly neglected, the child looked clean and well cared for, his clothes were new, and his parents were filthy. When Jenkins tried to make a fire, he was most disturbed to see that the ashes in the fireplace were organized in the same pattern as those painted on the walls, concentric rings with marks in between. "Always watches," she said, but it was unclear if she meant her child or her spouse. "It was as if someone had deliberately placed each ash," he said, "which seems impossible, yet cannot be otherwise explained." Using the limited supplies in the cabin, the men made food and lit a fire. When asked, James ate mechanically, but he gave no explanation for the situation in his home. The infant himself was the most disturbing. The Reverend later noted that James seemed present in body but absent in spirit, his eyes frequently darting to the cradle with an expression of what I can only describe as dread. Samuel Blackwood did not exhibit any of the typical infant behaviors at the age of 9 months. He didn't cry or reach for anything, he just watched, his eyes following the visitor's movements with what Dr. Hargrove called unnatural focus. The doctor observed that the child seemed well fed in spite of his parents' poor health, which he couldn't explain under the circumstances. According to his newspaper story, Turner tried to interact with the youngster by presenting a carved wooden horse he had brought as a gift, while the others took care of Martha and made meals. "The boy took it," said Turner, "and for a moment appeared as any child might, examining the toy with apparent curiosity. Then he looked directly into my eyes, and I felt understood, as if he comprehended not just my presence, but my thoughts, my very nature. In that moment, I heard a whisper, though no one in the room had spoken. It was not in English, nor any language I recognized, yet I felt that some meaning was being conveyed. When I looked away, breaking eye contact, the whisper ceased immediately. The next day, the guests made plans to transport Martha to town so she could receive the attention she needed. In exchange for James promising to bring himself and the child in with Martha before morning, they left food and wood for the night. But the Blackwoods had disappeared. The cottage was deserted, and there was no sign of where they had gone or how they had gotten there, considering Martha's condition. The symbols that had covered the walls were gone when he returned to the cabin, not scrubbed away, but apparently never there at all. According to Turner's account, the walls were bare, he said, showing no trace of the markings we had all observed the previous day. This situation disturbed him more than their disappearance, because it implied either a mass delusion among our party or something far more difficult to reconcile with my understanding of the world. A search was planned, but it was complicated by the rough terrain and the impending winter. After a few days, the search was called off since no sign of the family was discovered. Although no one was saw, Reverend Porter wrote in his journal that a number of the search party members claimed to have had a lingering feeling of being watched while in the woods close to the Blackwood cabin. Porter also admitted to another unsettling detail in a 1947 private letter to his bishop that was found in church archives following the first visit to the cabin. He found circular symbols painted in ash on his bed linens that were exactly the same as those recorded in the Blackwood cabin. "I have told no one," he wrote, "for fear of being thought unsound of mind. Yet I know these markings were not present when I left my home, and no one entered in my absence. I find myself unable to sleep, feeling always that I am watched from just beyond the threshold of perception." There, the story would have been tucked away as one of the many unexplained disappearances that took place in the remote areas of America throughout the 19th century. However, a surveyor named Edward Collins found an abandoned campsite in a small cave in April 1867 while surveying about 12 miles north of Hollow Creek. Personal belongings, such as Martha's Bible with her name written on the flyleaf, were found inside and were recognized as belonging to the Blackwood family. In his official report to the survey company, Collins said that the Bible was altered in a manner I hesitate to detail. When pressed by his superiors, he clarified that many pages had been removed, while others contained additions, symbols drawn in the margins, passages underlined or circled according to some pattern he could not discern. What was most unsettling were a few pages where individual letters had been circled across multiple lines of text, which when read aloud produced phrases in what appeared to be Latin, but were corrupted or purposefully changed to create unsettling effects. Collins reported discovering a series of odd marks etched onto the cave wall, but no trace of the family itself. Collins, an educated man interested in Native American artifacts, described them as neither letters nor pictures, but something in between, arranged in patterns that gave me a sense of profound unease. Collins said the markings did not resemble any known tribal symbols or pictographs that he was familiar with. I confess that upon discovering these markings, I felt compelled to trace them with my finger, Collins wrote in a private journal entry that was not included in his official report but was later donated to the Missouri Historical Society by his daughter. Upon doing so, I was overcome with a sensation I can only describe as opening, as if some barrier within my mind had been temporarily removed, and for a brief moment I perceived the cave not as it appeared to ordinary sight, but as something else entirely, a space that extended far beyond its physical dimensions, containing presences I could sense but not see, Collins wrote in another journal entry. A more extensive investigation of the area was carried out after the discovery rekindled interest in the Blackwood case. Searchers discovered what looked to be a shallow grave about half a mile from the cave. According to Newton County Sheriff Josiah Miller's report, among the contents were the remains of a woman who was thought to be Martha Blackwood because a silver locket bearing a miniature photograph that matched her description was discovered among the remains. The remains' status indicated that she had passed away soon after leaving the cabin, most likely as a result of exposure and her pre-existing frail state. Investigators were troubled by the body's position, which was described as arranged in an unnatural posture. The limbs placed at odd angles as if to form some specific pattern. A number of the men who participated in the exhumation later reported having severe nightmares in the weeks that followed. In his report, Dr. Hargrove, who examined the remains, pointed out a number of irregularities. The most unsettling finding was that her eyes had been bound with strips of cloth, with symbols drawn on them the same circular patterns that had been previously reported in the cabin. Martha's fingers showed signs of having been worn to the bone, as if she had been clawing at stone for an extended period before death. Her clothing, though weathered, had been arranged with peculiar care, certain items turned inside out, others folded in specific patterns. Hargrove acknowledged his mounting discomfort with the case in a private letter to Dr. Reed that was not made public until decades later. I find myself questioning observations I would previously have considered objective, he stated. Last night, while reviewing my notes on the Blackwood child, I distinctly heard whispering coming from the adjoining room, though I live alone since Sarah's passing. Upon investigation, I found nothing. Yet when I returned to my desk, the whispering resumed immediately. More troubling still, I understood it somehow, though I could not tell you now what was said. I feel my grip on rational thought slipping, and I fear it began the moment I first looked into that child's eyes. Neither James nor the child were discovered. By summer, there was no active inquiry, but the matter was still open. Then, in September 1867, a family passing through the area told Springfield officials about an odd experience. On a secluded trail, they reported encountering a father and young boy who fit James and Samuel Blackwood's descriptions. They described the man as wild-eyed and disheveled, and he would not give his name or whereabouts. They claimed that during the brief interaction, the child never spoke and instead gazed at them with eerie intensity. The most thorough description of this meeting came from Elizabeth Conrad, who had been visiting relatives close to the Missouri border with her husband and 2 kids. The man seemed almost afraid of the child. She wrote, keeping a certain distance from him at all times, never turning his back. When my husband offered to help, suggesting that we go to the next settlement, the man became very agitated, saying only, "He doesn't wish it." Conrad observed that although the man appeared disheveled, he spoke with the educated diction of someone who had received a good education, a detail that made authorities take the possibility that this was, in fact, James Blackwood more seriously. Conrad's tale of an encounter between her 6-year-old daughter and the Blackwood youngster was the most unsettling. According to Conrad, Mary went up to the boy and offered to share an apple. Before either my husband or I could intervene, she had taken his hand. She later told us that when their skin touched, she heard singing inside her head, though she could not repeat the melody. That night, and for several nights after, she woke screaming from nightmares she could not or would not describe. Even now, months later, she sometimes stops in the middle of play or conversation and stares vacantly, claiming she hears the boy's song again. With the exception of one detail that the man was carrying a diary from which many pages fell as he rapidly left, the family's claim could have been written off as just another unverifiable sighting. They gathered these documents and gave them to the police. The disjointed diary entries offered a troubling window into the family's last months and were eventually verified to be written by James Blackwood by comparison with Tennessee school records. The notes start off rather logically, with James recording his worries about Martha's deteriorating health and his own growing sleep issues. However, the writing starts to become more irregular by October 1866. According to one entry, S does not sleep. Subsequent entries grow increasingly disjointed and challenging to interpret, such as, his eyes remain open even in deepest night. M says he speaks to her when I'm not present, though his mouth does not move. The terms, the whispering and the watching, are used a lot. One passage, dated approximately 3 weeks before their disappearance from the cabin, reads, I have begun to understand fragments of what he whispers. It is not a language of this earth, yet meanings form in my mind unbidden. Today he showed me the true nature of the stars, not as we perceive them, but as they actually exist. I wept at the revelation, not from joy, but from the knowledge that what I had previously understood as reality was merely a shadow, a comforting illusion. Another entry, apparently written shortly before the visit from Reverend Porter and the others, states, M can no longer bear his gaze. She covers her eyes and speaks of the opening door and those who wait to enter. I have moved S' cradle to maintain the precise distance he requires. The proportions must be maintained exactly, or the symmetry fails. He has shown me how to draw the circles. My hands move without my direction now. The ash is more effective than ink. In one of the final legible passages, dated approximately 2 weeks before their disappearance from the cabin, James wrote, I know now why he never cries. What dwells behind those eyes has never been human, and has no need for such expressions. M understands now too late for her, I fear. Too late perhaps for me as well. The final page contains what appears to be an attempt by James to assert his own identity. Words like, I am still here, remember who you were, and others break up the monotonous writing of his name, which eventually devolves into a desperate scrawl before concluding with the line, he is not my son. He was never anyone's son. He is old beyond reckoning, and he seeks others like himself. The circles are doors, the whispers are keys. God help anyone who hears them, as I now do. Those who were familiar with the case debated these journal pieces extensively. After reading them, Dr. Hargrove allegedly informed Reverend Porter that he had grave concerns about the mental state of James Blackwood, implying that his wife's illness and the loneliness and stress of frontier life had led to a case of folie à deux, or shared hallucination. But Reverend Porter wasn't so sure. In a letter to his superior in Little Rock, he wrote, I cannot forget the stillness of that child, nor the manner in which his gaze followed us. There are things in these mountains older than our understanding, and some that perhaps we are not meant to understand. Meanwhile, 3 families reported that their children had started drawing circular symbols that resembled those in the Blackwood cabin, adding to Porter's worries. None of the youngsters had participated in the search or had any apparent relationship to the Blackwood family. But when asked, they all gave the same response. The watching boy showed me. When a hunter named Jeremiah Holt found what looked to be a recently abandoned camp some 20 miles west of the original Blackwood cabin in May 1868, the case took a new turn. A child's shoe that would have fit Samuel Blackwood at his present age was one of the things that was left behind. Even more unsettling were the reports of what Holt, a longtime local and expert on the forests, called drawings found on tree trunks near the campsite. Circular patterns of symbols similar to those reported in the cave by Collins a year earlier. Holt reported a number of strange occurrences while inspecting the campsite. The most disturbing was the sensation of time passing differently within the circle of marked trees. What I perceived as perhaps an hour of examination appeared to have been nearly 5 hours when I checked my timepiece upon leaving the area. Holt also reported finding a small journal, different from the one previously associated with James Blackwood. The air seemed to thicken, he wrote in his report to the sheriff, making it difficult to draw breath, though the day was clear and mild. Sounds became distorted, bird calls stretched and warped until they resembled words in no language I recognized. This notebook, written in what seemed like a child's hand but with language and ideas much above childlike comprehension, included notes about the nearby woodland that disturbed Holt because of their accuracy and the viewpoint they offered. The journal depicted trees, animals, and geological phenomena as though viewed simultaneously from all sides, past and present, inside and out, rather than as a human observer would. A portion of the report that Holt cited read, "The human perception of time as linear is their primary limitation. I have begun to help Father see beyond this constraint, though the knowledge causes him considerable distress. Mother could not endure the revelation. The others I seek will be better prepared to embrace such understanding." After learning about the case, Dr. Frederick Ashton, a Street Lewis anthropology professor, visited the area in June 1868 to look into these markings. Ashton tried to track the Blackwoods' movements by recording sightings and physical evidence, and his field notes, which were partially published in the Journal of American Folklore in 1870, described the symbols as bearing superficial resemblance to certain Osage protective sigils, but inverted in a manner that suggests a deliberate corruption of their intended purpose. His investigation made him wonder about James Blackwood's past. According to documents he discovered, James had not taught in Tennessee as he claimed before relocating to the Ozarks. Rather, Ashton discovered evidence that James had been admitted to an asylum in Nashville between 1861 and 1863 after suffering from what the records called episodes of profound paranoia and claims of communication with Proshos, entities he could not describe. Ashton copied all of the asylum's records, but only some of them were ever published, and they included a number of unsettling details. When James was restrained, he became violent, displaying strength that several grown men found difficult to control. James was admitted after an incident at the school where he taught, where he allegedly started drawing circular symbols on the chalkboard while speaking in what witnesses described as tongues, though, unlike any religious ecstasy previously observed, the most troubling thing to his doctors was his insistence that he could hear whispering that originated from between the stars, which he claimed was trying to teach him the true language, the first language, from before the world was as it is now. James was released in 1863, apparently recovered, with notes indicating he had come to recognize his experiences as delusions resulting from overwork and nervous exhaustion. He was noted to be generally lucid and cooperative during his time in the asylum, although he would occasionally attempt to draw the same circular symbols, claiming they were doors that must remain closed. He married Martha soon after, and they moved to the Ozarks the following year. No family history of mental illness or childhood events that could have contributed to his breakdown are mentioned in the asylum records. This finding gave the case a new perspective. Had the catastrophe that befell James Blackwood's family been caused by his mental instability, or was it that he saw something in his son that others were unable or unwilling to see? After returning from an expedition to a remote area where reports of a man and child having been sighted recently, Ashton became ill with a high fever, which ended his inquiry. He was said to have drawn repeated circular designs on any available surface and to have talked non-stop about the child who watches during his madness. Rebecca Winters, one of the nurses who cared for Ashton during his sickness, wrote a little journal in which she detailed her experiences. Several entries on Ashton's illness can be found in this diary, which was found among her belongings after her death in 1912. He speaks, in his Delirium of Doors, Opening Between Worlds. She said, "And of a child whose eyes contain multitudes. Most disturbing is his insistence that this child is now aware of him, is watching him, even across great distance. When in the grip of fever, he begs me to bind his eyes, saying, If I cannot see, perhaps I cannot be seen. Despite his physical recovery, Ashton asked to be sent back to St. Louis right away. He gave up on his investigation and declined to continue the conversation about the matter. Only some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. Some knowledge, once gained, cannot be forgotten. I pray that the Blackwood child remains unfound. Ashton resigned his job soon after returning to St. Louis and moved into a small cottage outside the city, where he lived in seclusion until his death, according to university records. His final note on the subject was discovered among his papers after his death in 1872. He kept a circle of salt around his bed, and, according to visitors, had no mirrors in his house. The sickness he had contracted, which his academic colleagues assumed had impacted his mind, was the cause of these peculiarities. Reports of a man and child being sighted in the more isolated areas of the Ozarks persisted for a number of years. However, these sightings stopped by 1870. The final confirmed report was from a mail carrier who saw a lone man who fit James Blackwood's description while hiking up a mountain. When asked about his kid while he was by himself, the dad reportedly responded, "He has no further need of me. He has found others who hear his whispers." Jacob Miller, the mail carrier, gave more information in a letter to his supervisor. "The man I encountered bore only passing resemblance to the James Blackwood I had known years earlier," he stated. He appeared to have aged decades in the span of a few years, his hair entirely white, his face deeply lined. Most striking were his eyes, which seemed to look both at and through me simultaneously. When I inquired after his son, a change came over his countenance, not grief or concern, but a profound relief. "He has no further need of me," he said. "He has found others who hear his whispers." Before I could question him further, he began to laugh, a sound so hollow and devoid of mirth that I found myself stepping backward. "They're coming through now," he said. "The circles are complete." He then turned and walked into the forest. I did not follow. If not for an occurrence that occurred in 1876, 10 years after the first events, the Blackwood family case may have completely vanished from the public consciousness. About 40 miles from Hollow Creek, a geological survey team working in an uncharted valley found the remnants of what looked to be a tiny settlement. 7 rudimentary shelters placed in a precise circle around a central open. Although all were deserted, there was evidence of recent occupation. The shelters were built with a precision at odds with their crude materials, each positioned at exactly the same distance from the center of the clearing and from each other, forming a perfect circle, according to his official report. Within this circle, the ground had been cleared of all vegetation and the soil compressed as if subjected to significant pressure, though from what source is unclear. Of particular note was the finding that each shelter had the same arrangements of personal belongings: a bed positioned against the north wall, a table against the east, a chair facing west. "The uniformity suggests ritual significance," Wilson wrote, though the purpose remains obscure. The finding of thorough diaries maintained by one of the settlement's members, only known as J.R., attracted special attention. Although the child is never named, the physical description, especially the focus on his peculiar eyes and manner, bears a striking resemblance to accounts of Samuel Blackwood. These writings describe the group's formation around a child leader whose guidance comes from beyond the veil of common understanding. The team's leader, Lawrence Wilson, took copious notes about the location. The journal entries become increasingly fragmented over time, with references to the changing and those who will emerge when the stars align. The last entry, made just weeks before the survey team's discovery, simply states, "He says, it is time. We go below to await the transformation." These journals indicate that the settlement's inhabitants thought the child had unique knowledge that would shield them from some unidentified coming calamity. In contrast to his official report, Wilson's personal notebook includes observations he thought were too conjectural to be officially recorded. "Each night spent near the settlement, all members of our party experienced similar dreams," he stated. A child's voice whispered endlessly, teaching what it called the true names of things. "When we woke up, we could all remember bits and pieces of this new language. but we couldn't or wouldn't speak it out loud. According to Wilson, his team encountered many equipment malfunctions while exploring the settlement. Compasses spun randomly, timepieces ran at inconsistent speeds, and photographic plates, when developed, showed images that did not correspond to the scenes the photographers believed they had captured. Most showed only concentric circles of light, with dark spaces between them. A thorough search of the area revealed a network of natural caves stretching beneath the valley. Although there was evidence of human habitation in the first few chambers, the situation was considered too hazardous for further investigation. A persistent humming at the threshold of hearing and whispers that seemed to come from all directions at once were among the strange auditory characteristics that several survey team members reported in the cave system. A distinct collection of notes about the cave system was kept by the team's geologist, Charles Beaumont. Beaumont also described finding a chamber with walls lined with tiny alcoves, each of which contained what looked like a child's shoe. Stalactites and stalagmites arranged in perfect circular patterns, minerals crystallized in configurations I have never encountered, and most disturbing, fossils embedded in the cave walls that correspond to no known species, exhibiting anatomical structures that appear to function according to biological principles entirely foreign to current scientific understanding. Beaumont wrote, "The formations we observed defy conventional geological understanding," he stated. "By my account, there were 23 such alcoves, according to him, each shoe distinct in design and apparent age, some appearing quite modern, others seemingly ancient. The suggestion that the child in question has been collecting children over an extended period is too terrible to contemplate seriously. Yet I find no rational alternative explanation." When the group tried to remove one of these shoes for further examination, Beaumont wrote that a sound like rushing wind filled the chamber, though the air remained perfectly still. The torches dimmed significantly, and each member of our party later reported experiencing a sensation of being observed from all directions simultaneously. I returned the shoe to its alcove, after which conditions returned to normal, though the sense of being watched persisted until we exited the cave system entirely. Fearing public hysteria or an inflow of curious people, local officials, who were already familiar with the Blackwood case, tried to hide the word of this discovery. With the exception of a brief article in the Springfield newspaper about the finding of a abandoned squatter settlement of no particular significance, their efforts were mainly successful, and the incident garnered minimal media notice. Wilson's group was told to send their results straight to the Department of the Interior, sealed. 2 weeks later, they received the official response, which instructed them to stop all site inquiry and to stop talking about what they had found. On later maps, the valley was identified as unsuitable for development due to unstable geological conditions, a description that remained in place until 1920, when the valley was completely removed from updated maps of the area. The settlement was the subject of a small private investigation headed by Dr. Thomas Reed, who had written to Dr. Hargrove 10 years prior regarding the Blackwood child. Although his results were never made public, they were kept in the Missouri Historical Society's archives and were virtually forgotten until 1952, when a researcher by the name of Margaret Collins uncovered them. In late 1876, some 3 months after Wilson's crew had left, Reed traveled to the valley with 2 university colleagues and a local guide who knew the area. With one notable exception, the middle clearing, which had been depicted as being devoid of vegetation, now sported a solitary sapling of an unknown species. His notes report discovering the settlement precisely as Wilson had described. "This growth appears unlike any known botanical specimen," Reed stated. "The leaves are arranged in perfect circular patterns around the stem, and the root system, visible above the soil in places, extends outward in precise radial symmetry. Most unusual is the bark, which appears to be inscribed with minute variations of the circular symbols previously associated with the Blackwood case." For 3 days, Reed's group explored the cave system and town. According to his notes, the group's uneasiness grew after their initial investigation, with his co-workers complaining of trouble sleeping and the guide declining to let them into the caves. Reed himself reported going through periods of fugue, in which he would find himself at the entrance to the cave or in front of one of the shelters, unable to recall ever having moved there. By the third day, Reed says, the sapling had grown noticeably, an impossibility given the time frame, yet undeniable when compared to our initial measurements. That night, Reed's colleagues tried to remove a cutting off the tree for examination. His description of what followed represents the most direct account of unexplained phenomena associated with the case. Upon Jay's knife touching the bark, a sound like that of a child's voice emanated, not from the tree, but from the air around us, a whisper that somehow reached each of us with equal clarity, regardless of our positions. The words were not in English, yet we understood their meaning with terrible clarity. The circles must remain unbroken. Simultaneously, the temperature dropped precipitously, frost forming on the ground despite the summer evening. The sapling's leaves began to move, though there was no wind, turning to face us like so many eyes. Jay dropped the knife and stepped back, at which point the phenomena ceased immediately, temperatures returning to normal as if nothing had occurred. We departed the following morning by mutual agreement, though none of us discussed the incident directly. Upon reaching Springfield, J and L immediately continued to Street Lewis, while our guide disappeared after being paid, having spoken hardly a word since that night. I remain to document these findings, though I do so with the growing conviction that further investigation would be not merely unwise, but dangerous. A hand-drawn map of the settlement's location is included in Reed's final notes, but it clearly states that no man should seek this place. This map and the majority of Reed's documentation were sealed in the archive, with the directive that it not be opened for 50 years. A directive that was followed until Collins's discovery in 1952. Working on a thorough history of the Ozark region, Collins was astounded by Reed's report's thorough descriptions of the symbols discovered all around the settlement. Circular patterns that were exactly the same as those that had been connected to the Blackwood case. Reed's transcriptions of interviews with local communities revealed more troubling information. In the months preceding the settlement's abandonment, a disproportionate number of people had passed through the area, many of them looking distant or confused, and all of them were heading toward the valley. These reports indicate that the tourists came from a wide range of backgrounds and places, including as far away as New York and even Europe. But they all talked about the same things: dreams of circular doorways, whispers teaching a new language, and a compulsion to seek the watching child. What was most concerning, though, was how many of these travelers were children, many of whom seemed to be traveling alone, and who were all described as unnaturally quiet and focused in purpose. Based on Reed's writings, Collins tried to pinpoint the settlement's location. However, the terrain had altered significantly over the years, and geographical allusions were purposefully ambiguous. Finding that many of the original documents pertaining to the Blackwood case had been deleted from county records without identifying who did so or why further hindered her investigation. Inquiring about Wilson's survey, she was told by the Department of the Interior that no record existed of a geological expedition to that region in 1876, even though she had copies of Wilson's official letterhead and parts of his report. Following further inquiries, she received a formal letter warning that continued pursuit of this matter could be considered interference with government operations, which she described as strangely disproportionate to what should have been a simple historical inquiry. Collins was unfazed and carried on with her inquiry, putting ads in local newspapers asking for information from the heirs of the original case participants. Her efforts were not very successful until she got a letter from Eleanor Hargrove, Dr. William Hargrove's granddaughter, who had saved her grandfather's personal belongings, such as letters and journals that weren't part of the official files. These materials were discovered in a locked chest in her grandfather's attic, secured with elaborate measures that seemed excessive for personal papers. The chest, Eleanor wrote in her letter to Collins, was bound with chains arranged in a pattern she later recognized from Collins's advertisement as similar to the circular symbols associated with the Blackwood case. Within were a large number of case-related, the Dachshunds, done. documents, and personal journals that detailed Hargrove's continuing experiences after his involvement. One of these items was a sealed envelope that was stamped to be destroyed, unread upon my death. Eleanor, or her father, had likely broken the seal before Eleanor did. It contained a thorough description of Dr. Hargrove's last meeting with James Blackwood, which reportedly took place in 1873, 7 years after the family vanished from the cabin. This story goes that Hargrove met James on a distant route as he was on his way back from seeing a patient. James was lucid, despite looking much older than his years. He went into great detail about his son, saying that Samuel was never truly ours, and that what gazed from behind his eyes was ancient before the mountains rose. James asserted that his son had found others who could hear his whispers and was preparing for a return. According to Hargrove's account, James displayed an odd duality throughout their conversation, alternately speaking in that other language and then returning to himself without realizing the lapse. In one such episode, James allegedly said, "They have always been here, watching from behind the veil of perception. The child is merely their most recent doorway, the most successful of their attempts to bridge the gap. There have been others before, and there will be more if he succeeds." When Hargrove asked him to elaborate, James reportedly became agitated and said only that science and religion both failed to explain him, failed to contain him. Before leaving, James gave Hargrove a small cloth-wrapped object, telling him to keep it hidden, for it attracts his attention. The item, described as a small stone carving of indeterminate shape, was included with the letter. Most unsettling were his reports of catching glimpses of a child watching from corners of rooms, from spaces too small to contain a human form, always peripherally, never directly observable. He also recorded many cases of hearing whispers when near the object, and dreaming of circular doorways opening onto vistas that cannot exist in our world. Eleanor Hargrove mentioned that her grandpa had kept it hidden in a metal box until his death, and Hargrove wrote in his last journal entry, 3 days before he passed away from what appeared to be a stroke in 1879, "I understand now what James meant." Hargrove became persuaded that the carving somehow linked him to the Blackwood child, as evidenced by his later diary entries. Neither science nor religion provided a framework to contain or explain what Samuel was, or rather, what looked out from behind Samuel's eyes. Our comprehension is limited by the very structures of thought we have built to make sense of the world. What we perceive as reality is merely the surface of something far more complex and alien than we can safely contemplate. The circles are maps. The whispers are invitations. I have requested that this carving be sealed away with me, though I fear even death may not sever the connection entirely. Collins made arrangements to see the object. Her description of it is found in her notes. Approximately 3 inches in length, carved from a dark, unidentified stone. The shape suggests a humanoid figure, but distorted in a manner that creates profound unease when viewed directly. Most disturbing is the sensation that the proportions seem to shift subtly when not under direct observation. A colleague of Collins's in the field reported that the stone was unlike any known terrestrial mineral, exhibiting properties that defied conventional analysis. Under magnification, the surface revealed patterns resembling the circular symbols repeated at microscopic scale throughout the material, suggesting that the carving was not shaped to resemble these patterns, but rather that the material itself inherently contained them. Within moments of looking at the carving, Collins recalled having vivid dreams in which she was guided through mountain tunnels by a child whose face remained in shadow. She also claimed to have heard murmurs in a language she could not understand, but which still made sense to her dreaming mind. These visions, which she eventually came to believe held instructions to the settlement's location, began to dominate her study notes. In her last journal entry, Collins wrote, "The circles are not merely symbols, but keys to perception. Each night in dreams, he teaches me to see differently, to recognize patterns previously invisible. The settlement isn't hidden in physical space so much as it exists at an intersection our normal perception filters out. I believe I can now find it while awake, following the patterns rather than conventional geographical markers. In April 1953, Collins told colleagues that she had identified the likely location of the 1,876 settlement and planned to visit the site. On April 15th, she left Springfield and was never seen again. In a rural part of the Ozarks, a search turned up her abandoned car close to a trailhead, but despite a lot of work, no more evidence was located. Investigators discovered a number of unusual things about her car. Though it had apparently been parked for several days, no dust had settled on its surface. The interior temperature was described as unnaturally cold despite warm spring weather. Most notably, the inside of the windshield was covered with drawings in condensation, circular patterns identical to those associated with the Blackwood case. Her research materials, including the Hargrove documents and her own thorough notes, were discovered during the investigation into Collins' disappearance. The historical significance of these materials was not given much consideration by authorities, who were more focused on finding Collins. Her files were finally archived, following the then standard process for missing person cases, and the Blackwood case once more faded from the public consciousness. It's unclear what became to the stone carving. Despite being included as evidence in Collins's disappearance, it was never found and was never found among her belongings. Sheriff Robert Tanner, the main investigator, mentioned it only once in his official reports, stating that he had secured the item in question without going into any detail. 6 months later, Tanner abruptly quit, citing health issues, and left the area. For this account, attempts to get in touch with him failed, as a research assistant named David Reeves cataloged artifacts for the newly created Ozark Cultural Heritage Center in 1968. He discovered Collins's files. He was fascinated by the case and tried to put the disparate pieces of material together to create what he thought was the most comprehensive timeline of events to date. But his work was never published. Colleagues claim that as Reeves' studies developed, he grew more reclusive and ultimately took a long leave of absence from which he never returned. Dr. Marion Foster, a colleague, later stated that Reeves had started sketching circular symbols on research notes and in book margins in the weeks before to his departure. He claimed they helped him think more clearly, Foster said. His assertion that he could sometimes hear whispers emanating from the drawings themselves, whispers, he claimed, were teaching him the true language. The files were once again archived, this time with a notation restricting access. When I asked their significance, he said they represented doorways of perception that the Blackwood child had discovered or created. They were kept secret until 1965, when a regular declassification review opened them up to eligible scholars. Since the case was typically viewed as either a complex regional folktale or a tragic frontier family drama, few expressed interest. One last point is worth mentioning. Workers found a sealed cave entrance in 1968 while excavating for a new reservoir that would flood parts of the valley where the settlement was thought to have been. Evidence of human occupation, including artifacts from the 1,872nd, was found during the initial exploration. The most important finding was the identification of a little room with walls covered in the circular symbols that were previously connected to the Blackwood case. Howard Mitchell, the project engineer, reluctantly recorded the discovery in his official report. The markings exhibit properties that defy conventional explanation, he stated. Mitchell also observed that the chamber had peculiar acoustic characteristics. When illuminated directly, they appear as simple circular patterns carved into the stone. When viewed peripherally or in partial darkness, however, observers unanimously report that the circles appear to contain depth, as if they were openings rather than carvings. The most unsettling was the finding in the middle of the chamber of what he described as a tree growing from solid stone, a tree with leaves arranged in perfect circles around each branch. Spectrographic analysis of these recordings revealed patterns that linguists consulted by the project identified as potentially language-like in structure, though corresponding to no known human language. Recording equipment recorded what he described as whispers at the threshold of audibility, apparently originating from the circular markings themselves. When taken to the location, botanical specialists were unable to identify the species and voiced confusion over how it could live without water or soil. There were equipment malfunctions, and, in one instance, a researcher who had a seizure-like episode during which he spoke fluently in an unidentified language. Before comprehensive documentation could be finished, however, the cave system was sealed off by an unexpected collapse. According to the project engineer's report, the collapse was caused by natural instability in the limestone formation. Yet a number of employees subsequently asserted that there was no clear trigger event. With its contents conserved but inaccessible, the cave system is currently submerged under 50 feet of water. Mitchell's private notes, which he shared with a University of Missouri colleague but never formally submitted, conveyed his intense discomfort with the location. "What we found goes beyond archaeological curiosity," he stated. The consistent reports from multiple team members of dreams following exposure to the chamber dreams of circular doorways and whispering voices cannot be dismissed as mere suggestion or hysteria. Something was preserved in that cave, something that interacts with human consciousness in ways I cannot explain but deeply fear. One of the most perplexing cases in Ozark history is still the Blackwood case. Was Samuel Blackwood only a child exhibiting strange characteristics that became the subject of growing paranoia during a time of isolation and little medical knowledge? Was James Blackwood a disturbed individual whose delusions spread via suggestion? Or was there something genuinely unexplained about the infant that neither science nor religion could sufficiently explain, as some people still whisper in the far reaches of the Ozarks? We are positive that many others who encountered the case between 1866 and 1876 shared comparable experiences and observations, many of which were recorded by well-educated and influential individuals. The regularity of these stories, which span 10 years and involve people who don't seem to be related to each other, defies easy explanation. The symbols, the circular patterns recorded in several places over several years, are usually the focus of the few scholars who still sometimes revisit the issue. Some have proposed links to unknown Native American customs, while others have pointed to cryptic religious rituals. Everyone acknowledges that the actual meaning, if any, remains elusive. According to Emily Thornton, a folklorist at the University of Arkansas and an expert on the case, its strength is in its inability to be easily categorized. The Blackwood case occupies an uneasy space between historical account and folklore, she noted in a report published in 2009. Thornton notes that many aspects of the case fit with common folkloric motifs: the changeling child, doorways to other realms, and secret languages that confer power. The concrete documentation, medical records, official reports, physical evidence anchors it in historical reality, while the reported phenomena, whispering voices, circular doorways, altered perception, push it into the realm of the supernatural. She contends that what distinguishes the Blackwood case is not the existence of these components, but rather their persistent appearance during decades of Blackwood case recording, as described by people who seem to have no link to or awareness of one another. The pattern of disappearances linked to the case not just the Blackwood family, but also Margaret Collins, David Reeves, and perhaps others whose ties to the case have faded with time is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of it. In the Ozarks, even today, local guides occasionally caution tourists against going alone into some isolated areas or asking too many questions about the watching child. In the more remote areas of the Ozarks, there are still sporadic tales of hikers losing time or hearing voices in the deep forests, or of circle patterns discovered on trees or cave walls. These are typically dismissed by park rangers and local officials as adornments motivated by knowledge with the Blackwood tale. However, the mythology endures, along with the unsolved problems it raises. How did Samuel Blackwood end up? Did he find others who could hear his whispers, as James had indicated in his last meeting with Dr. Hargrove? Does anything continue to roam the isolated Ozark valleys, observing from behind the eyes of a child who never really was in the sense that we know existence? As Dr. Hargrove wrote in his last letter, the case of Samuel Blackwood ultimately remains something that neither science nor religion could explain. Perhaps, as Reverend Porter hinted in his journal, there are some mysteries in these old mountains that we are not supposed to fully comprehend. If you see a child alone in the woods, watching silently. Do not meet its gaze. Turn back the way you came. And do not look behind you until you reach familiar ground. Locals still occasionally offer this advice, which has been passed down through the generations, to those who find themselves traveling the back roads of the Ozarks, especially as evening draws near. Whether this is just folklore or a warning born of genuine experience is a question each traveler must answer for themselves. Some stories once heard leave echoes that never completely go away, and the mountains are good at keeping their secrets. In his final journal entry, written just before his death, Dr. Hargrove wrote, "We believe we understand the world because we have named its parts and cataloged its behaviors. But beneath the thin veneer of our understanding lies something else entirely, something that watches us through the cracks in our perception, patient and ancient beyond reckoning. The child showed me these cracks. I cannot unsee them now." This may be the most appropriate epitaph for the Blackwood lawsuit,